Time for some econ review. All right, so we're just going to go through basic supply and demand stuff, talk about elasticity, jog your memory so you're ready to go for the semester. All right, so start with demand here. Demand, relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that people want to buy. And demand is always going to be a downward sloping curve. That means that as the price goes up, people buy less. The price goes down, people buy more. In your intro classes, you always use linear demand curves. That won't be true in intermediate. And the other difference is that normally when we write a demand curve, we want to know quantity as a function of price. Based on the price, how much will people buy? So here you can see we've written Q equals 24 minus 4P. And that's a little different than what you wrote in your intro classes where you had P equals something. That's technically an inverse demand curve. And the difference is really the ease of graphing, right? It's a lot easier to graph if you have P equals something. But that's technically what we would call an inverse demand curve. Let's go ahead and write the inverse demand curve here. So we just need to rearrange this. So we've got 4P equals 24 minus Q, and then divide everything by 4. I get P equals 6 minus 2.5Q. Sorry, 0.25Q. Okay. Now, right, you can see this is inverse demand, and that's going to be easier to graph because I've got price on my y-axis, and I can easily see the intercept is 6. Of course, the x-intercept will be 6 divided by 0.25, but we already know what that is, right? In this equation, it's 24. All right, so I've got my demand curve there. It's a downward sloping line. That means as the price goes up, people buy less, and as the price goes down, people buy more. So what is the quantity demanded when the price is 4? So now we're plugging numbers into this equation. So if P is 4, then Q is 8. And if P is 2, Q will be 16. Now notice that as the price changes, the quantity demand changes. That's a movement along the demand curve and not a shift in demand. All right, we go on to supply. Supply is the relationship between price and the quantity of a good that people want to sell. And supply is going to be an upward sloping curve. Okay. Again, you're probably used to seeing this written P equals instead of Q equals. We can just rearrange here. To get what we want. There's our supply curve. And to get this answer to how much people would buy, or sorry, how much people would sell if the price were 4, again, we're just going to plug in price to our equation. You can see at a price of 4, people would buy 16 units. As the price goes down to 2, we'll find that less worthwhile, and the quantity supplied would drop to 8 units. So again, supply is upward sloping. As the price changes, we have a decrease. As the price goes down, we have a decrease in quantity supplied. That is not a shift in the supply curve or a change in supply, just a movement along the supply curve. Equilibrium in this model is the point where there's no force for change, right? And that's where supply is equal to demand. The equilibrium point on the graph is here, right, where the two lines cross. And we can find that point by setting our supply equation and our demand equation equal to each other. And we can either do that using our inverse demand equation and supply, or we can just use regular supply and demand. So we get 8p equals 3. You should get the same answer either way. Oh, whoops, 8p equals, jumping ahead of myself here, 24. So p is equal to 3. And then I can plug that back in to get q. And I get 12. So my equilibrium price and quantity are 3 and 12. And the meaning of equilibrium here is actually quite profound. The equilibrium is the point where all mutually beneficial trades are exhausted. Okay, so everybody who can benefit from trading gets to do so. They get to trade, they both benefit, and everyone is made better off through trade. We can see that also because it is the place where total surplus is maximized. What happens if we're not at the equilibrium point? Well, if we're at a price higher than the equilibrium, then we will have quantity demanded that is smaller than our quantity supplied, and therefore we will have excess supply. And vice versa, if the price were below the equilibrium price, our quantity demanded would be bigger than our quantity supplied, and we would have excess demand. All of this is movements along the supply and demand curve. We've had no shift in supply or demand up to this point. Of course, supply and demand can shift, and hopefully you remember the factors that influence them to shift, like consumer income or new production technologies. We're not going to go through all of those, but I do want to remind you what those comparative statics look like. And that might be a new word for you, but when we have a model and then we change one of the variables in the model, we call that comparative statics. What happens if I change one thing, holding everything else in the model constant? Okay, so here, say if I have an increase in demand, holding supply constant, okay, got my increase in demand here, what's going to happen is that my quantity is going to increase and my price is also going to increase. So when demand increases, I have an increase in both quantity and price. For supply, if I have an increase in supply, that's an outward shift, always an outward shift. That means that my quantity is increasing, but my price is decreasing. And that makes sense, right? If there's more of this product out there for sale, we're going to sell more and the price is going to be pushed down. Good. So good refresher on supply and demand. We'll move on now to elasticity.